Welcome back to AP U.S. History. We're talking about Eisenhower's presidency. This is chapter 27. We've talked about a variety of things about Eisenhower, from civil rights, his domestic policies were like. Now we're talking about the Cold War and how he treated the Chinese and also the Soviets, who were communist countries at the time. We talked about Stalin dying in 1953, and Nikita Khrushchev comes in. He will promote a new policy of peaceful coexistence with the West, and particularly the United States. Oh, by the way, the secret word for this video is brinkmanship. That is, taking it right to the limit, never backing down. He wanted to impress the world that the Soviet system was the best system. War with the United States wasn't necessarily inevitable. Tensions between the two nations seemed to ease a bit. But he certainly wanted to, through peaceful competition, demonstrate the superiority of the Soviet system. Eisenhower initiates a Geneva summit to ease tension, but no formal agreement was made. Both America and the Soviets acknowledged the need to reduce nuclear weapons because you can destroy the world 40 times over. Maybe that's a little too much. Nikita Khrushchev is going to make speeches, particularly at the UN, about capitalists. He states it doesn't depend on you whether the UN or Soviet Union exists. If you don't like us, don't accept our initiatives, and don't invite us to come to see you. Whether you like it or not, history is on our side. We will bury you. And this is he was also denounced Stalin as being cruel and dictatorial, and a lot of the things that Stalin stood for, he denounced. There was the Hungarian uprising in 1956, a group of freedom fighters, I call them freedom fighters, who wanted to throw off the communist government. Staged a revolt. There was shooting. They wanted a democracy-type government, and they wanted their independence from the Soviet Union. Hungarians aspired by U.S. Position to free people. Soviet tanks and soldiers roll in and they crush the rebellion. The United States is unable to help because they fear that a nuclear war will ensue if we send troops to help the freedom fighters. Eisenhower, unwilling to use massive retaliation over Hungary, doesn't believe that it's our national interests are at stake here. And I think that he was right. The U.S. and the Soviet relationship sour again over this Hungarian uprising. The Sputnik 1957 was launched by the Soviets, and they're going to have the first satellite to orbit the world. A lot of Americans are horrified that somehow the Russians have got the technological edge, and that soon they'll be able to send nuclear warheads through outer space. A lot of Americans demand that we do something, and particularly in our education field. So the National Defense Education Act is passed, and this is to train more scientists and engineers. And there was a lot of emphasis on math and science. Of course, the old Sputnik there, and racing around the world. The Russians have beaten America in space. They have a technological edge. Remember, they were after the United States in terms of developing the atomic bomb. After they received secret plans from the Rosenberg couple, they were able to catch up. The government funds are poured into public education. A lot of universities their programs are expanded to encourage new students to study engineering and science, and with the hopes of building better weapon systems and also the technology to get into outer space. 1958, we're going to launch our first orbiting satellite, Explorer 1. NASA, National Aeronautics Space Administration, or agency, is put together, and this is to help us beat the Soviets into outer space and to the moon. The U.S. conducts massive arms buildup, more B-52 bombers, missiles, nuclear subs, so we're off to the arms race again. Then there was an unfortunate thing called the U-2 incident. We were sending spy planes at high altitude over the Soviet Union to spy on them. This shows a picture of NASA. This is a picture of a U-2 plane, and it would take photographs. It was very fast. We believe that they were not capable of shooting airplanes down at a certain altitude because of the speed and the altitude of the plane. And of course, the Soviets didn't like this, and eventually they're going to develop some rockets that are going to be able to shoot down the plane. And in 1960, Gary Powers, who is shot down, taken captive, is an embarrassment to the world, the United States. Eisenhower has to admit that we've been flying secret missions to spy on the Soviets. Khrushchev demanded an apology, but Eisenhower said, "No thanks. We're not going to apologize to you." Plans for a parent summit where the two could talk about disarming and living more peacefully together is abandoned. Then comes along the Suez Canal crisis. Egyptian President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal that was owned by the French and the British stockholders. Of course, the French and the British don't like this, and so they're going to attack Egypt to get the canal back. This picture shows a picture of Gary Powers standing before the Supreme Soviet, admitting that he's a spy. The Soviet Union will back the Egyptians in the struggle, and again, the Americans will back the Egyptians, and they'll force the British and the French to back down. So Britain and France withdraw their troops, and World War III is averted. Egyptians control the canal to this day. Now, Eisenhower's doctrine allowed U.S. to send aid to the Middle East that were threatened by communist elements. This shows the Suez Canal in 1956, 1957. And eventually, Israel got involved in this along with the British and French, and they are going to be forced to back down because they don't want to go toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union or the United States. Even though France and Great Britain had been our allies in World War II, we sort of come down on the side of the Egyptians. Cuba is going to be another sore point for the Americans, and this will lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1960s under Kennedy. But Fidel Castro will take over Cuba in 1959 from Batista, and the communists will, from that point on, rule the island. Khrushchev stated that Cuba was under its nuclear umbrella and that the Monroe Doctrine was dead, and that somehow they were going to support them. CIA ordered to hit on Castro, but they failed. Castro sees the U.S. as a threat to his national security, and he will embrace Castro in 1961. Evaluation of Eisenhower's administration. America is prosperous during the Eisenhower years. People are working. The New Deal and the progressive ideas that were brought on by FDR and Truman are continued. So he is what I would say, a compassionate conservative. Fiscally, he was pro-business and less taxes on the rich, but he also wanted to help the poorer folks. In terms of civil rights for blacks, he certainly was reluctant to get involved in this, but will eventually do the right thing by ordering troops to enforce the Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus Board of Education, desegregating public schools in the South. He will end the Korean War with threat of nuclear weapons. He just said, listen, if you guys continue on with this war, we're going to drop bombs on you. North Koreans said, maybe we should just sue for a ceasefire, and that's what we've had ever since. Eisenhower exercised restraint in military affairs despite his military background. The Federal Highway Project will provide about 42,000 miles of roads, and is sold under national defense. He will keep Americans out of the war with the Soviets, which is remarkable in a period where it looked like we might go to war any day. And we'll stop here, and we'll pick this up back in chapter Civil